start this meeting, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we're meeting across Australia and pay my respect to the elders past, present and emerging. So my name is Rita Brown. I'm the President of the Australian BPD Foundation, and I would like to welcome you all here to the meeting tonight with Julie and Carolyn, who will be giving us an overview on sensory modulation with people with borderline personality disorder. So I'll hand over to you, Julie and Carolyn.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for having us here today. We're really excited to be invited here to talk about sensory modulation and its value as an intervention for all people. But today, as you said, we'll be focusing more specifically on its use and value for people with BPD.
Can we just ask, are you able to see the slides there?
I am, yes.
Good.
Okay, excellent. So we'll speak through the presentation. We'll speak to the slides, and hopefully they'll be quite helpful in helping people apply the information that we're talking about. So that's us. So myself, Julie, I've worked in mental health with adults for many years and used sensory modulation and use a sensory lens in my work with many people. Carolyn, did you want to quickly?
Yeah. So I've been trained in dialectical behaviour therapy, so I have an interest in working with lovely people with BPD, and a happy BPD Awareness Week. Then after the DBT training, I also started incorporating more sensory modulation because we could see the benefits of that as well.
Thank you. So when people, probably many people have heard of the term sensory modulation. It's growing in I guess awareness and interest over the last over decade and a half. And so when you hear the term sensory modulation, we can actually be referring to two different things: the neurological process of sensory modulation and the intervention, the clinical intervention of sensory modulation. So today we'll be really focusing on the intervention of sensory modulation. So a really easy way of explaining what sensory modulation is as an intervention is this: it's changing how we feel through using our senses. And if we see this lovely photo in the slide here of a little boy, he's actually using sensory modulation in his day-to-day. So to give you a bit of a background, so this little gent is camping with his friends, with his family, and woke up one morning and didn't have a really good sleep, was really hot, was feeling a bit flustered, stubbed his toe on a rock, and so his toe was throbbing and feeling sore. So he got up and had some breakfast, but it's not necessarily the breakfast he usually likes to eat. So he had a bowl of cornflakes with milk, and by the time he ate it, the cornflakes was a bit soggy and not crunchy, and the milk was a bit hot, and so he's feeling, pretty tired and had a bit of pain in his foot and a bit miserable and hot and bothered. So his very clever mother suggested that why doesn't the family after breakfast go down to the lake and have a swim? And so as soon as this little boy hit the water and had the lovely cool water around him and was splashing in the water and moving his limbs, he was able to instantly change how he felt through using that sensory input. And so what we find is that people are often using sensory modulation in their day-to-day and not really realising it. And so the role of building people's awareness of sensory modulation is to help them use these techniques in situations where they would really like to and have benefit to change how they feel.
Julie, can I just say the slides don't seem to be changing?
Oh, so which one are you up to now?
What is sensory modulation, changing how you feel through using your senses?
Yeah, that's the slide we're up to. So okay. Have we got this one now? Yep. So when we, I guess, when we talk about changing how you feel, we could be talking about many aspects of changing how I feel, and it encompasses our emotions, so changing our emotions, changing our physiology, and changing our alertness levels. So if we're using sensory modulation to change how we feel, change our emotions, we might be using it to turn down our anxiety, to help us feel more calm and at ease and relaxed, to help us feel safe, to feel less angry and frustrated, and to feel maybe more happy and more joyful and excited. So we can use sensory modulation to help change those emotions. We can also use sensory modulation to help change our physiology. So this might be to take down or reduce tension in our muscles, or maybe temperature in our body. It might help us reduce feelings of sickness or pain. So that's about changing those physiological aspects of our body. And then we can also use sensory modulation to change our levels of alertness. So that might be to turn alertness up or to turn it down, depending on what we want to do in that situation. And so occupational therapists will use and explore many different senses as part of sensory modulation. And I guess most people are aware of 5 senses in our bodies. So that's sight, sound, smell, touch, and taste. But OTs love to talk about 8 senses. And there's actually more senses than that, but OTs like to focus on 8 because we can use these quite artfully when we're doing sensory modulation. So the other 3 senses that OTs like to talk about and explain and explore are our vestibular sensory system, which is movement. We like to talk about also and explore proprioception, which is our awareness of our body and our joints and our arms and our legs in space and in the environment. And interoception, which is one that's probably the least known, I guess, but is growing in awareness, and it's a really interesting sensory system, and that's our inner sensations, our inner sensory system, or our visceral senses. So the feeling of our heart rate, the feeling of our breathing, our internal temperature, that feeling of hunger and thirst, and many others. So occupational therapists like to explore and identify all these different 8 senses and use them artfully when we're doing sensory modulation. So I guess early on, when people were first talking about sensory modulation, it was mainly referred to as helping people to either calm or alert. But what we know in actual fact is that it has much wider scope of practice, or a scope of changing how we feel. And so this infographic is a way of explaining, you know, the many and varied ways that we can use sensory modulation to change how we feel. And so one of those, if we start sort of on the right hand side, one of those is to help people feel safe. So if you think about, you know, certain environments, we know that certain sensory input can actually make us feel a little bit sort of on edge or on guard, or a bit unsafe. So there might be lots of shadows and not very clear lights. We can't sort of see very well visually, or there might be loud, unexpected noise or flashing lights. And so those sorts of environments can increase our feelings of not feeling very safe or very secure. And so likewise, certain sensory input can help us feel safe. So thinking about, you know, safe spaces or safe environments, and the sensory input that's helping do that. And I think another aspect of feeling safe is, you know, using sensory input in that way can help us create positive associations and help us increase feelings of control and security. Sensory modulation can also be very useful to help us feel grounded, which is that sort of physical and bodily sort of sense of connection and sort of security. And that's a really important sort of sensation so that we can feel at ease and sort of move through the world with less anxiety. Sensory modulation can help us because it can provide an alternative to self-harm. We can use intense or competing sensory input as an alternative to self-injurious behaviours. We can also use sensory input and practice using sensory input as an alternative to self-harm to help us strengthen and develop healthy habits. Sensory modulation can be very helpful in helping us cope with pain, with illness, with grief, and with coping with urges to use substances as well. Again, by offering alternatives to help us sort of surf those urges, but also to help provide options that we can find soothing and calming and nurturing. If you think about, I guess, the activities or the interests that we have that help us, enjoy aspects of life or build pleasure, a lot of them centre around sensory input. So sensory modulation can be, really valuable to help us increase feelings of pleasure, happiness, joy, excitement, those sorts of things. And as we mentioned, it can help us to feel calm, so to turn down stress levels and help us feel more relaxed and at ease, and to help us feel more focused. Over to you, Carolyn.
Thanks, Julie. So we like to say that you're already using sensory modulation, so you will be using it in your day-to-day life. But clients haven't necessarily been able to learn the same sort of techniques that you're probably automatically doing without thinking. So part of what we do in sensory modulation is we just make obvious the things that where a lot of people are doing automatically, so that people can use them in different situations. And there are a lot of therapies that have some sensory input as part of it, and you're probably already quite familiar with it. So, with those sensory aspects. So we just like to highlight that, there are some overlaps with some of the other different therapies that you're probably doing, and that through learning more about sensory modulation, you can basically extend your repertoire and have more options available for people, and more of an understanding of how to tailor it for an individual in collaboration with the individual who is the expert on their senses. CBT, pleasurable events, activities, scheduling, relaxation are often to do with the senses. DBT soothes with 5 senses, and then DBT-A soothes with 6 senses because they added movement. Then Row DBT added deep pressure as well. So what we've seen with DBT is that, they've been expanding the number of senses that, can be soothed. And we would also highlight that the tip skills, have a very sensory aspect to them as well. And I guess one of the things with sensory modulation is that we have a different understanding of why that would work. We see that those are bottom-up processes, whereas a lot of the time they're conceptualized as top-down processes. Habit reversal training has a sensory component for those of you who do that. Julie's already mentioned grounding strategies and safety with trauma-informed care. Lots of people are using crisis kits, little boxes where you can keep your sensory items so that you know where they are in a particular crisis. A lot of trauma-informed yoga, Pilates, movement, it's happening in this space, and also sensory motor interventions. Also the smart arousal trauma therapy. So this is just a bit of context, or a bit of an overview of how it's being used in Australia. Sensory modulation started to be used to reduce seclusion and restraint, which, as we know, is very, very important for people with BPD, who, it's so traumatizing for them to be secluded and restrained. So sensory modulation started to be used on a national level within inpatient psychiatric units. There's also some emergency departments that are using them. And then there's been research shown that through having environments with more sensory options on it and more sensory tools on the wards for people to use, that people are able to use those options to calm and regulate, which has prevented the escalation that's then unfortunately led to the seclusion or restraint. There was a review in New South Wales in 2018, and they identified that changing the environments to make them more sensory friendly was very important. So the New South Wales government put 20 million into that. And they also, there's a quote from there, sensory interventions such as weighted blankets, changing temperature, light or sound input can assist consumers with emotional regulation and result in a decrease in seclusion and restraint. And that's just a lovely mural on one of the inpatient units. So that then became national policy. So the National Recovery Framework recommends that clinicians be trained in non-forceful therapeutic crisis interventions, including sensory modulation strategies. So I think this is important for people to sort of know that you've got permission to use sensory modulation. In fact, it's in Australia, it's national recovery policy. Another really interesting thing that's been happening is the development of more safe spaces, and the idea with this is that they're a safe place for people to go as an alternative to going to an emergency department for those that can do that. So a couple of examples of safe spaces is the safe space in Blacktown Mental Health and also the Brisbane North Safe Space. So there's a network. It was a collaborative with Brisbane North Safe Space, and they've got a document on setting up a safe space, a resource guide that outlines how to do that. And some of these spaces are really using a lot of sensory modulation concepts and in the design of the space, and also having a range of sensory items for people to be able to calm. And Julie and I have been really excited about that because it means that people have been able to trial those options and then to be able to consider using them at home. And a lot of those, with those two programs, they're very much used sort of Kmart and cheap kind of options so that people know that they can afford some of these items to be able to use. They don't have to go to some expensive websites. So I think that that's a fantastic development. And the Queensland government has set up has funded 8 safe haven cafes in regional Queensland. And we're fingers crossed that they have a sensory aspect to them as well. So you don't have to have a knowledge of sensory processing in order to do sensory modulation. As we mentioned before, you've already been doing it most of your life. You know, if you've had a stressful day, you probably turn down the lights, turn off the noise, say, no, I don't feel like any music at the moment. Or you might go for a jog or increase the input, but you have a tailored routine that you already have, that you know that you do when you're stressed. It can enhance your knowledge of sensory modulation if you understand sensory processing. So a lot of people hear about sensory processing in relation to people with an autism diagnosis, in that people with autism have been found to either be sensitive to sensory input or seeking of sensory input. And the continuum that we're talking about with autism is actually everyone is on that continuum in terms of sensory processing. So it's just that people with autism have it at a more extreme level. So the model that we use is based on Winnie Dunn's model of sensory processing. And OTs talk about 4 different types of sensory processing styles that you can have. And I guess the 5th one is that you're average. You're like, you know, the majority of people who actually, you know, don't have this difficulty. And I'm going to use the analogy of a pair of socks, just to give you a brief sort of overview of this. So someone who's sensory sensitive is They basically, a little bit of sensory input feels like a lot to their nervous systems, and the message just keeps coming through. So if they had a sock on and it had a bit of a, seam on it, their brain would just keep going, seam, 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 seam. It wouldn't stop with that. The people who are sensory sensitive, their brains don't habituate to that. Their brain just keeps sending them that message over and over again. Now, someone who had who didn't have sensory sensitivity, their brain would go, seam, oh yeah, that's okay, I'll get used to that. And then their brain would get used to it, and their brain wouldn't send them that message anymore. But so this is really important to know with people with BPD. If they're saying that they aren't getting used to and aren't habituating to a particular sense, that's really important to believe them, because that is really what's happening. So people who are sensory avoiding of sensory input, they're not even wearing the socks. They're just like, I'd rather go barefoot, because they know that they don't like those seams in those socks, or they've bought the special socks that don't have any seams in it. So they've just avoided the whole sort of thing so that they're not getting that sensory input, because they know how difficult that is for them. So someone who's sensory seeking of sensory input loves a variety of input, and they like novel and intense sort of input. So someone might wear like socks with like little plasticky bits on the end of it one day, and bobbly socks another day, and then have masseur sandals with socks and silk another day, so that they've got like a whole variety of their sock experiences, and they might actually start to feel a bit low if they're not getting new sock experiences. Obviously, it's not all to do with socks, but I'm really going to town with this metaphor.
It's a great metaphor.
It's working so well.
I like it.
Okay, so if someone is a sensory seeker, they can have a really low mood if nothing new and exciting or different is happening. And then there's people who are sensory missing, also known as low registration, and so they miss sensory input unless it becomes intense. So with their sock example, they might have like a hole in the sock and their little toes poking out of it, but they haven't noticed that input because it just wasn't that strong and intense. So it would need to be like a really large hole, or like lots of their toes kind of poking out of it before they would notice that. And there's an overlap between that and I guess some of the dissociative experiences that some people with BPD also experience. So have a look at that, have a think of that sensory processing model. And the other thing that's particularly important with people with BPD is that you might be sensitive for one sense, but seeking or missing for another. So it's not like an overall pattern in our experience with people with BPD. Some people with autism are like sensitive, to every different sensory input. But people with trauma histories and BPD, there can be a variety of those as well. Or people can be, say, seeking for scent, but then have like trauma triggers with scent, which really it's hard for people to understand and get their head around. It's like, but I love different scents, like why am I feeling so crap? So there's really complicated overlays, I think, that we're we need to understand more from a research perspective. Talking about the research, so if you're Googling this stuff, you kind of have to go to like 2019, 2020, like there's more research happening in this area all the time. So it's, if you're interested in it, Julie and I try and put papers on the Sensory Modulation Brisbane Facebook page. So the references to the stuff on this slide is actually on there. So what they've found so far in terms of sensory processing for people with BPD is that there's an increase of sensory sensitivity and sensory avoiding sensory profiles. There's impaired auditory sensory gating. So people with BPD have been found to notice new sounds faster than other people. And you can sort of see how that can be both a strength but also a difficulty that people have to then manage in their lives when you think about being able to notice little sounds that maybe other people aren't noticing or being bothered by, and particularly in relation to sleep, I think. There's been found to be decreased body awareness. So Ruth Lanius has found that people with BPD have more difficulties with balance and with clumsiness, if you want to think of it that way, or more kind of bumping into things. I don't like the word clumsy, but that's the word that she uses. And that's because of the disturbance to the vestibular and the proprioceptive centres that happen with trauma. So Ruth Lanius is really one to watch in this area. She's doing some really interesting work with trauma in particular and PTSD. Not BPD as much with this, but one to watch. Increased body dissociation. So obviously when you dissociate and you're not feeling and registering a lot of sensory input. So sensory modulation really helps people who are experiencing that dissociation to be able to feel sensory input again. And we're talking about feeling sensory input, not just thinking about the sensory input. And Julie, we'll go into that more with grounding soon. They've also found decreased interoceptive sensitivity. So interoception, as Julie mentioned, is that awareness of your internal body sensations. So if you're not aware of your heart rate or your breathing or what's going on in your body, it's harder to then be able to connect that to emotional states until it's intense. So that's been found. Also decreased pain sensitivity. And they've also found that 30% of people with chronic pain have BPD. So there's lots of work to do. And I think a lot of people with BPD that I've met have chronic pain conditions as well, that also need tailored therapy for them. There's also some evidence about sensory seeking to movement input, which does make sense that movement is regulating. So Julie and I, when we went through the research, were like, this isn't quite reflecting what Julie and I find in clinical practice. So we've just put down, not that we think that there's a type of sensory processing that is going to be diagnostic of BPD. What we're talking about here is that, there's some common themes that seem to happen, and to listen out for that if someone is talking about it, to see if that is true for them. And they might have a different experience, and that would also fit. But these are some of our commonalities that we've noticed. Sensory sensitive to scent, and also scent trauma triggers, as I mentioned before. Sensory sensitive to sound, so really noticing sounds in the environment and having quite a startle reaction to them, impacting on sleep, as I mentioned before. Sensory sensitivity to light. So in our room here, we've got a dimmer switch, and just being able to, ask someone, what sort of light level would you like? Like, would you like me to turn this dimmer switch down? And just sort of seeing that sometimes people just relax just through, turning that down. So sometimes what we're talking about is turning down sensory input, not just adding sensory input in. And visual movement is things that are moving. So a car moving past or other things can be something that the brain sometimes struggles to process. So for some people with BPD, being in a crowded situation or having lots of visual input is overwhelming and hard to make sense of, which then feels more unsafe and can lead to anxiety or panic in crowded or situations with a lot of visual movement, which can be a sensory experience, not just about, I don't think I'm safe, but this moving around me is just too much and I can't register it. Sensory sensitive to light touch. So there's a difference between light touch and deep touch. So that's that kind of like tickly touch. So some people are really very sensitive to that. Sensory sensitive to food textures. So the feeling of certain foods within the mouth, because there's touch within the mouth as well that can be processed. And sensory seeking for deep touch and proprioception. So that's the pushing and pulling of the muscles, really strong kind of exercise or, weighted items we're talking about there. sensory seeking for vestibular input. We kind of go bet each way, but it's sort of like some are like really want that kind of like movement input, and others it makes sick, and you have to sort of be really gentle with it. So for some people, you know, if you suggest going into hammock, they'll be like, oh, I'm going to be sick. And for other people, they're like, oh, that's so calming. So there's a lot of individual variation with those. Missing interoceptive signals, and there's a whole lot of undiagnosed medical issues, chronic pain, endometriosis, fibromyalgia, and EDS, I think, as well, that you know, needs a lot more research, because we're seeing a really big theme there happening with the people with BPD.
So we thought we'd just briefly run through some of that information about how sensory modulation works. So in the interest of time, we can't go through this in a huge amount of detail, and we do have more of this detail in some of our other resources, which we can talk about right at the end. But basically, sensory modulation is considered predominantly a bottom-up intervention. So what does that basically mean? So as Carolyn mentioned earlier, bottom-up interventions use body-based input like sensory input to basically, and what that input does is its mechanism of action is that it hits the lower centres of the brain more directly, and in doing that it affects our autonomic nervous system more directly. So activating you know, your sympathetic nervous system and your parasympathetic nervous system, and obviously depending on what that sensory input is. And so that's different obviously to top-down interventions, which use the higher centres of the brain, the thinking parts of the brain, like the cerebral cortex, to sort of change the stress levels and how a person feels. And so why use bottom-up mechanisms? So what the research does tell us is that when a person experiences emotional distress or dysregulation, it's actually harder for us to access those higher parts of the brain, those thinking parts. And Dan Siegel talks about, you know, the brain flipping its lid. So in those emotional states, it's really hard to think our way out of that experience. So we can use a bottom-up intervention to directly change or shift that autonomic nervous system to get that lid flipped back down, so that then we can sort of move to work out what we want to do next. And so because of that, bottom-up mechanisms are very useful when a person is feeling heightened anxiety, if they're feeling angry, if they're hyper-aroused, if they have a trauma history, because what the research also shows is that disconnect is more pronounced when people have had sort of a trauma background. Sensory modulation as a bottom-up mechanism is really helpful for younger people as well, whose cerebral cortex hasn't developed as much because of time. And it's also useful for people with cognitive impairment, and that includes people with dementia or delirium. As we also mentioned earlier in the piece, changing our physiology in our body in itself can create a shift in how we feel. So the example of the little boy camping and jumping in the cold water. So having that cold water and that splashing sensation and moving his body helped to change his physiology, which then shifted how he felt in that moment. And another example of that is if a person's feeling really angry, and you know that you often get sort of tension and heat, you know, in our face and in our hands, and so using cold temperature in that situation can affect the physiology, change that physiology, and that can help shift how that person feels in that moment as well. As we mentioned before, a new sensation or new sensory input can actually help us change a habit. And you think about, you know, if people are wanting to reduce their alcohol intake or try and not smoke as much, and what we do or what a person does in helping them do that is by replacing that habit or that behaviour with a new habit, and sensory input can be really effective in that space. And so sensory modulation can pair very, very well with healthy habit formation and habit changes. or habit training, sorry. I think most people who use sensory modulation will say that you know, the art and process of sensory modulation can really help enhance a therapeutic relationship. And if you think about that, when offering or suggesting sensory modulation, we're using or suggesting strategies that are really quite simple, quite easy to use. They work effectively, and they're often, you know, quite soothing or nurturing, depending on the sensory input. And just that process, I think, of offering something when a person is in distress or when they're not feeling great and they want to change how they feel is, you know, a very nurturing thing to do. And so, working with someone who feels that sense that you're trying to help them and offer them tools in itself is a great way of building and working on that therapeutic relationship. Sensory modulation, as we mentioned, is a trauma-informed approach. So in using sensory modulation, we are acknowledging and respecting a person's trauma history, but also because the strategies are a bottom-up mechanism, they are effective and they work well when a person is experiencing you know, the symptoms or you know, experiences of trauma like dissociation and like feeling unsafe or feeling anxious. So that's sort of where sensory modulation is really a very effective go-to strategy or intervention for people who have a lived experience of trauma. And because sensory modulation really promotes the person to be the expert in their self-management, in learning strategies to help them change how they feel or to help them function and cope in different situations. It's very client-centered, which is really important when working with people with BPD. So what Carolyn and I thought we would do now also is I guess just quickly run through some common sensory experiences for people with BPD, and I guess how sensory modulation can be utilised quite effectively to assist with these scenarios. So some of these we've mentioned, so we'll run through that fairly quickly. So as people are quite aware of, that sensory input can be very powerful. So there's certain smells and sounds and sights and touch that can really change how we feel very quickly. And that can sometimes be quite a positive experience, but it can also be sometimes quite negative. And I guess that's where we can come into this realm of sensory triggers. So, you know, a particular or a unique sensation can be very triggering and can trigger a memory of trauma. And then what that will lead to is heightened anxiety and the experience of flashbacks and dissociation. So when we're using sensory modulation in this space, what Carolyn and I will often talk about is that we don't need to necessarily know what the situation or the circumstance is behind that sensory trigger. We just need to know that there is a sensory trigger and be aware of that. So the context, I guess, behind it is respectfully avoided. But in doing that, though, we can still very much do good work around what we can do to manage or avoid those sensory triggers. And a safety planning can be a really good starting point for that. We would also say, especially with the sensory input of scent, because that's a very fast and powerful sensory trigger, that people need to be in control of scent, and it needs to be able to be contained, and that person needs to be, you know, controlling that. And so for that reason, we would not advise, or we don't suggest that people use aromatherapy diffusers in clinics or in sort of open spaces for that reason. And if you have a person that is, you feel that they have sensory triggers that are really impacting on their functioning, then that might be an opportunity to refer to an OT to do that work. So sensory overload, which people are probably also aware of, is when the levels of sensory input are too much, too overwhelming. So from an auditory perspective, things can be too loud, or there can be multiple layers of sound, which can be overwhelming. Visual input might be too bright. or there might be too much in someone's visual field. Vestibular or movement input might be too fast, or too much novelty, or the orientation or the type of the direction of the movement might be too much for a person. And Carolyn talked about people being sensitive in that vestibular with vestibular input, and touch could be too much or too overwhelming too.
And I think people think of this in terms of autism, but we're saying also think of it in terms of people with BPD.
Yeah. And so a good, I guess, approach if someone is sensory overloaded is to turn down sensory input. So again, as Carolyn mentioned before, sometimes when we're looking at sensory modulation, we're kind of adding or building in sensory input, but sometimes it's very important and helpful to turn down sensory input as well. So that might be about lowering light levels, reducing sound, maybe reducing talking to the person, because if they're very overloaded or overwhelmed, they're not really going to be registering that information at that point in time anyway. Turning down touch input, visual movement, and definitely turning down scent, as we mentioned before, a very powerful sensory input. And a product that Carolyn and I often talk about is a product called nil odor, which is great to be able to kind of eradicate scent in an environment. So we'll be turning down that sensory input, but depending on the individual and their preferences, we might carefully use other sensory input to help when a person is in that overload. So that might involve individually preferred proprioceptive or deep pressure input, sort of gentle vestibular input like rocking or swaying, and touch input like a warm bath or a blanket or something around a person's shoulders. And then the shutdown or freeze scenario. So that's where I guess a person is feeling spacey, numb, dissociation, I guess is a sort of clinical term that's used there, where the person feels unreal and sometimes seems to present in that sort of deer in the headlights presentation. And so what shutdown or freeze represents is activation of the dorsal vagal parasympathetic nervous system, and that's where our system perceives extreme threat or danger and triggers an immobilization response, and that's that shutdown, spacey presentation. And so what's really important to note here is that it's a perceived threat or danger. It doesn't necessarily mean an actual danger, but it's perceived by the person and their system. And so this state is really can be very common for people who've experienced trauma. And Stephen Porges has done a lot of work on polyvagal theory in that space as well, if you're interested to read more. So again, if a person is in that shutdown or freeze space, reducing stimulation can be really important, and at the same time helping the person increase their feelings of safety and grounding. And you can do that through deep pressure, gentle movement, proprioceptive input, and soothing sounds, for example, white noise or music, soft music that person finds soothing and safe. Over to you, Carolyn.
Thanks, Julie. So this slide is about considering some different types of sensory input in relation to people who may be self-harming and who would like an alternative to that. So I think often what we hear therapists talk about is changing from that experience to then soothing the body mindfully with intention and self-compassion. And some people can do that, which is fantastic, and other people find that that's too big a leap. So if we kind of look at this staircase kind of idea, and using intense sensations can be still a strong, intense sensations are not necessarily pleasant or nurturing. They're sort of like, a very intense sort of like, lemon juice or gargling with mouthwash, or, quite like warheads, quite sort of strong sort of sensations. So that might be, an easier alternative for people than going straight to soothing. And we would also say that practicing soothing or doing something relaxing might be a step, and then you can layer over mindfulness and then layer over the intent to be self-compassion as well. So these are some of our, sensory modulation interventions that we find really useful for people with BPD. We're going to outline these a bit more in this, this next section. So we're going to be talking about using scent, temperature, weighted items, chewing and movement. So with cooling, there's a huge range of options that, that can occur, and cooling can be really useful for anxiety and anger, particularly as when the sympathetic nervous system is going, you've got a lot of blood flowing around, so you've actually often got a lot of heat. Although with anxiety, some people do get cold hands. So again, there can be individual differences, but as a process, it's often, bringing blood flow to the surface. So if you then cool the surface, that's going to reverse that blood flow. It can be helpful for dissociation because it's a strong input, and it can also be helpful for nightmares, insomnia, flashbacks. But the more intense ones, you should consider asking a GP before using with some medical conditions, heart, pregnancy, anorexia. And what we're talking about there is the sort of more intense sort of cooling. So we've got a range of cooling sensations here. So you can just keep a wet face washer in the fridge and put that over. That's here we go. That's show and tell.
Show and tell. This is my favourite part.
So, some people find that very relaxing, just putting a cold face washer over the face, or having like a spray bottle in the fridge.
I didn't bring a spray. I did bring a gel pack.
And the next slide we'll talk about the cold water in the Ziploc bag, or you can have cold water in a bowl, or ice cubes in a face washer, or an ice pack. And there's a couple of parts of the body that tend to be more pronounced effect, and that is the sort of area just under your eyes, and the carotid artery here, and a little bit behind the back of the neck. So there's a reflex. This skill is used in DBT as well, under the tip skills. But we think that everyone in Australia should know about this technique. So using a Ziploc bag means that it's portable, so you can have it in your office, or people can just take an empty Ziploc bag. Here we go, Julie's got one here.
There's no little goldfish in there, it's just the water.
Yeah, so you can just be out, get your Ziploc bag out, pour some cold water in, and then put it over your face, under the eyes. And at first you're like, oh, whoa, that's a bit much. So often you sort of need to take it off and then put it back on. And we usually say having it on for about a minute can really help, and that's been shown to drop the heart rate, drop that sympathetic nervous system very quickly, and also bring people back from a dorsal vagal response, so back from a freeze response as well, if they can tolerate that and they're not too dissociated. So definitely that's one of our fave sort of techniques with clients, is to have a look at what kind of cooling options might work for them. Weighted options, so there's a whole range of things. There's nothing magic in a weighted blanket, it's just that it's heavy. And so if you look at something that's about 10% of, up to 10% of your body weight for an adult, and up to 5% of your body weight for a child. So just filling up a backpack, having a pet on your lap, a weighted cushion, a bag of rice, wet towels. So Julie's got a couple of things that she's showing here. So we just get like a 5 kilo bag of rice. Even just try that on your lap, and if you don't like it, you've got some rice, saved for quarantine or whatever as well. So it's win-win.
Over dinner.
Yeah. in Queensland, it gets very hot, so having like wet towels in the bath, just putting that over you can help as well. And again, useful for grounding, anxiety, dissociation, and anger, and handy to have in therapy rooms too. So, I've got like just a 5 kilo bag of rice inside a nice fabric cushion. And if someone is starting to look a bit spacey or a bit anxious, I say, would you like to try this? This is a weighted cushion. If they don't want to try it, I'm like, that's okay. Or if they look uncertain, I just sort of say, we might try something else. But often when people have put that onto their lap, then they do start to feel calmer, and we found that works really well. People must be able to remove it themselves, though. It's a really trapped kind of a feeling if you can't get something off you. So it's really important people have to be able to get it off themselves, and they have to have that individual choice. You can get overheated with it too. So, weighted blankets are so trendy that they're now even in, Kmart and Spotlight. But if you get the really fleecy ones, it's going to be really hot in summer. So it's better to get one without the fleece, and then just put it inside like a fleecy quilt cover or a cotton cover if you want that, rather than having something that's really hot, because we've already identified that people with BPD might have difficulty with noticing some of those sensations. So they might not notice that they're getting too hot, which could be dangerous from a thermoregulation perspective. When there's less of your body that's covered, you're not going to get overheat as well. So that's why we tend to talk more about weighted cushions and wet towels and things like that as well. So safe scent, as we mentioned before, can be a trauma trigger, but it can also be a safety trigger. So if you have a safe person, if you can say to the person, what's a safe smell? Is there something that reminds you of a safe person? So, if your grandma was a safe person, what smell reminds you of your grandma? And can you take that smell around with you? Is there a safe place? Like if the beach is your safe space, can you have a bit of sand or something, salt or something that reminds you of the sea? And by smelling that can be a safety trigger instead of a trauma trigger, which, as we know, can be a very, quick pathway to the brain.
Thanks, Carolyn. So we talked a little bit, or mentioned a little bit, about grounding sensations. And so as we mentioned, grounding from a sensory perspective is that feeling of connection and centeredness in our body, in our physical sort of body. And so it's more than, or it's different to a kind of a cognitive process. It's more about that feeling that we get in ourselves, where we feel centered and connected. And I think if you think about if I don't have that feeling, if that feeling is not very strong, then it's, it makes sense that I would feel a bit less easy, a bit more uneasy and a bit more insecure in sort of navigating myself through the environment, through the world. So feeling grounded and feeling connected helps me feel safe, helps me feel less anxious, and helps me sort of move through and what I need to be doing. So when and not feeling grounded, not feeling connected to our body and to ourselves can be quite a common experience for people with BPD. And so it can really be very helpful to help a person learn ways to feel grounded. And so from a sensory perspective, we would focus on using sensory input that we would refer to as the power sensations. So they are touch, proprioception and vestibular input. So for touch, it's more that deep pressure touch. So, having something weighted or, something heavy in our lap, or a heavy backpack, or something that's sort of giving us that deep pressure in our body. Temperature can be a useful way of grounding, as Carolyn mentioned before. So using that icy water to invoke the dive reflex can be really helpful. For proprioception, so that's that pushing and pulling of our ligaments. So, you know, doing joint compressions and stretching. You know, a lot of people find exercises like yoga and Tai Chi quite good in that space too, because they're of that sort of pushing and pulling and holding strong contractions. So you're getting that sort of proprioceptive input there, and vestibular or movement input like rocking or swaying, and probably something like spinning would be a little bit too much, too overwhelming, but maybe rocking or swaying, depending on the person.
Just because of time, I think we'll just we've already sort of mentioned intense sensations.
Yeah,
and I think we can put up. We've got a list of intense sensations that we can put on our Facebook page.
Yeah.
And we've also got a list of soothing through movement that we can put up on that page as well.
Right.
And these are some lists for alternative to self-harm. I think we'll just put that one up on our Facebook page as well too, because we wanted to skip to the difficulty sleeping. So in our sensory modulation resource manual, we've got 5 strategies for the different senses, because we found that a lot of people go, whoa, there's so many senses, there's so much, so where do I start? So we've gone through in the book and just put different clinical scenarios, and then we've just put the 5 sort of things that might be good ones to get you started. When people are having trouble sleeping, and we know that a lot of people with BPD really have a lot of trouble unwinding and going to sleep and then staying asleep, we know that that's also because their sympathetic nervous system is really revved up. They're hearing a noise and then they're having a really intense reaction to that noise, and they're having a long time returning to baseline. So just thinking about things is going to be a very slow sort of way of being able to do that. So we recommend some of the faster sort of sensory strategies. So using the cold water, as we mentioned before, it seems like it wouldn't help you get to sleep, but if you're hot, you're not going to be able to get to sleep. So cooling towels, cooling face, chilly towels, any of those things can be really useful for sleeping or the dive reflex. Changing the environment or the bed, so you know, increasing the security, like having an alarm door stop at the door. No one's going to come in, and logically you know that you're safe. But if you have a little door jam there and you know that a car alarm sound's going to go off if the door, if someone tries to open the door, that might help people to relax and really know I'm definitely safe. Some people have tried the sleep hygiene and the lights off and it's not working, and so for some people sleeping with a lamp on, you know, might work more, or having layers of white noise machines to sort of mask and not have that sound that then they have to be hypervigilant to and then recover from. So we usually say like a white noise machine rather than the phone, because phone can just kind of keep getting notifications. Deep pressure, swinging or rocking, or standing by the bed until you feel tired and then getting into the bed. There's some of our faves. So we've got a picture of the white noise machine there, and we've just got some options for, you know, clinicians who are there who are like, well, where do I get started? You don't have to spend a lot of money. Just, you know, make yourself up a weighted cushion, a Ziploc bag in the fridge. Try not to use the aromatherapy, as we mentioned before, or music in the waiting room, so that people can individually bring their own music. Have a few fidget items and hand strengtheners. So that picture is of a hand strengthener, a dimming light, and our handouts on soothing and intense sensation to give people some other choices. So this is just some calming strategies that can be useful in COVID. So we'll pop that on our Facebook page again as well.
I have so much stuff.
I don't know whether you're going to get the hands or not, sorry, but we'll just pop it there in case.
Yes. And so just something that Carolyn and I always mention when we're using sensory modulation, to use it effectively and for the best outcome for our the people that we're working with or supporting, that sensory modulation always needs to be sane. So safe, appropriate, individualized and meaningful. So obviously when we mean, what we mean by safe is safe emotionally and physically for the individual. When we say appropriate, that's, you know, that we need to consider how appropriate the strategies are for the person in relation to their age, their gender identity, their culture, the environment in which they're using the strategies, and the affordability of those strategies as well, just to name a few. The strategies need to be individualised, which means they're tailored to the person's unique preferences and needs, and meaningful. So, you know, does the person, ideally, do they know why it's being offered in the first place, and does it make sense to them as to why they're using it? And I think, again, look, that's all pretty intuitive sort of stuff that, you know, that a sensation may be safe for some and not for others. So that's why we just need to be very aware, and that's why exploring sensory strategies with our clients is so important. And I think, you know, when we talk about safety, obviously the issue of risk comes up, and that's a really important thing to explore. But I think to have a robust exploration about risk, you need to look at both sides of risk. So the potential risk of using sensory modulation strategies, but also the potential risk of not using the strategies. And so we need to look at both of those.
And the picture is just of little scented items in a jar, so that, you know, people can individually put the lid back on if they don't like it.
Control and contain. Yeah. And finally, you know, as we mentioned, sensory modulation is very person-centered, client-centered. So it's really important to be mindful of a person's individual differences. So every person is their own expert, and that's what we work towards in helping a person use sensory modulation. And the clinician or the support person's role is to guide that. And, you know, help the person develop their understanding of what might work for them and build their self-management skills and confidence. And if the person says no to a suggestion, that's okay, leave it and try something else. So what we thought we'd also just talk to people about very briefly is, obviously this presentation is very much a summary of some of the work and the information that we talk about in relation to sensory modulation. So if people are interested to learn more, Carolyn and I have a couple of resources that we can sort of refer you to. So one is our sensory modulation resource manual, which is available through these bookstores and Amazon and the book depository, and I guess it goes into a lot more detail in relation to what sensory modulation is, the neuroscience, mechanisms of action, the different senses, and how to use it and apply it in your day-to-day. And Carolyn and I have also developed a using sensory modulation online course. So this is available through Eventbrite and Course Rebel. And so this is a 5-hour course that has a number of different modules. And so if you purchase this course, you have access, or you're registered to use that course as an individual for 1 whole year. And in that year, that means that you can revisit all our modules and information as many times as you would like. And it also gives you access to all the slides, our videos, all our infographics and handouts as well.
That's just how to contact us. So I think we're hoping to have some questions now. So the first question is, what are your thoughts on the way interoception presents in BPD? Do we see trends? What we notice is that it can either be something that people are very sensitive to, but also sometimes fluctuates and then not feel anything. So I think that probably also ties into dissociation. So some people, you know, notice their heart rate too much and, you know, very concerned, like the bladder is telling me to go to the toilet now. You know, things are very sort of, you know, read at a very low level of input and then seen as a stronger sensation. But then for other people, the sensations need to get very strong. So we've got a whole heap of people with BPD who say that they don't feel hunger, you know, don't notice temperature variations, you know, have trouble with the bladder and bowel, and obviously, you know, we've mentioned there's sort of other medical issues going on as well. And
may only notice it when it's really intense, and so then it can be quite distressing and quite uncomfortable, and you know, then that can interfere with you know, how a person then sort of navigates what they're doing in that moment.
Yeah, and I think Kelly Marler's work on interoception, the interoception curriculum, is really helpful for people with BPD to be able to go through and just ask that question as well of, how does your heart feel? How do your lungs feel? And then to sort of look at words and then connecting them with particular emotions as well. So I think when we're talking about emotions, we just kind of need to go to the layer underneath that of interoception and sensory input to make sure that people are connecting that in the same way that we do. Because if you say, are you feeling anxious, and the person can't feel their heart rate and have never noticed that their hands get clammy and cold, then that's going to be a harder thing to describe. So that's why interoception is so important. Next question, do you want to read that out?
Yes. Which particular sensory items have you found to be the most important inside a therapy space if people were going for an initial basic setup? If people are looking to set up a therapy space or a community sort of sensory space, we do, in our resource manual, we have lots and lots of information about how to do that and some different suggestions of some different sensory strategies or sensory items. And we also divide it into kind of, the really affordable ones that are really easy to access and accessible and affordable. And often, Carol and I will say, sometimes that's really important too, because if items tend to kind of, I guess sometimes people say it going missing, but it's actually people kind of using the items, then they're easy to be able to purchase again. But we also have ideas about bigger ticket items as well, like if you have funding at the end of a financial year and want to buy a few things. So but basically I think Carol and I are both of the opinion that when you're starting up, especially using things that are really accessible, easy to get, affordable, mirror things that people would have in their home, so that it's more likely that person connects with those strategies and also can transfer and use those strategies in the environment as well.
I think that cheap weighted cushion, like so many times Julie and I have found like weighted cushion works with someone. Like I remember going into this home with adolescents who were in a residential facility, and this one was just like cuddling the weighted cushion, and I was just like, you can have it, like to take it off someone who's like really loving it and grounded, like just like you can have it. So that's another reason to have it. This is my 50th weighted cushion because they're all around our local area now with clients. But that's good. I think Carolyn and I see that as people connecting with the strategies and the resources and getting some value out of it. So again, that's why it's good that it can be very affordable. Go affordable.
Carolyn and Julie, I've just there's a couple of people ask questions about being able to access the slides after the presentation. Will you be able to?
We're very happy to share them.
Okay. People have also asked about, there's a number of references throughout your presentation. Are they written on your website, or can you send those as well?
A lot of them are on the slide. We have a reference list on the end of the slides as well. So
the ones with the BPD ones are on the Facebook page.
Yeah.
And the Facebook page is called?
Sensory Modulation Brisbane.
Okay, great. And you've also mentioned earlier in the presentation about someone called Ruth.
Ruth Lanius. Yes, sorry.
Sorry, her surname?
Ruth Lanius.
Can you write it in the chat box maybe so people can see it?
If I spell it Lanius.
Okay. Yep.
Ruth has done work on trauma and PTSD, and she is she's just worked out more of the neurological processes underlying depersonalization, derealization, dissociation, and that some of them are to do with the vestibular and proprioceptive systems. So she's really recommending more of the type of techniques that we've been describing today. It's a shame because it doesn't say BPD, But as we know, a lot of people with BPD have a trauma history, so I think it's very applicable. And Ruth has a course on at the moment where she has an hour talking about sensory processing and trauma, which is a very good description. It's a paid course, but you can look at that as well.
Yeah. Okay. So there's also been quite a few comments about trauma informed and people being experienced forced sensory connection in DBT groups and have got a traumatic memory of these. And the majority of DBT programs aren't trauma informed. And now people can be adverse to actually engaging with sensory modulation. And there's also some comments about not necessarily some practitioners not understanding the science behind sensory modulation and just handing things out. This is helpful, give it a go.
Yeah, I think, I very much agree with those comments. I think it's one of the things that I found when I was a group facilitator. I really had that understanding that, if someone didn't want to try a sensation, that was okay. But the DBT model was to try it and experience it. And so Julie and I diverged from DBT on that. We think that if an individual doesn't want to try a sensation or they know that that's not right for them, then they shouldn't do that. They shouldn't be forced to do it. And we're very sad when sensory modulation is not used in that way. We're very much into client-centered, the person being in control and trauma-informed, which, as you know, we spoke about that throughout that. But I think, it's very sad that people haven't got that understanding, because there's no one thing that's going to, work for anyone, but anything that's done in a forced way is going to become a triggering thing, not a safe thing. Like a weighted cushion forced onto you is traumatic. It's not going to be safe and calming. So yeah, it's, there's a lot of work that needs to be done with trauma informed. And I think, unfortunately, particularly in our hospital environments, there's a lot of work that needs to be done there. So Julie and I are happy to train any organisations that want to. It's actually one of the reasons why we wrote the book as well, because we thought, we can see that this works, but we want people to be able to go about it in a way that's, client-centred and trauma-informed.
And one question that I have is, how do you manage the hygiene and the cleanliness aspect of a number of those different sensory modulation tools?
Well, I guess the ones that we've sort of mentioned, fidget items, I guess you just wipe. The weighted cushions, we take the cushion cover off and wash. The Ziploc bags, we just ask the person, to use hand sanitizer and then get the Ziploc bag out. And a lot of the time what you're doing is connecting things that the person already has. So someone at home might be going, actually, do you know what? When I'm feeling overwhelmed, I do like to just go into my room and pile on all the blankets and even towels on top of me. And we go, yes, that's right. You're doing something that you need then. You're doing something that's really safe and right for you. So people often, if you look around a person's house, they already have the sensory things that they like for them, but it's a matter of just, suggesting and connecting that rather than necessarily buying it. Like a whole lot of people don't need to buy very much. Yeah.
I was actually thinking more of an inpatient type of setting.
Yes, often in boxes. So, good inpatient ones include like earplugs. If it's an inpatient unit, that can have the sleep phones where there's like music in a headphone kind of capacity. Some mental health units are letting people use them. Wiping down or having like an individual kit beside their bed, like a boxes, like they're my sensory items and they're lower cost items. It is harder at the moment though.
Yeah. I think some inpatient units have where they have the resources, you know, where they might run activities, diversional activities on the inpatient unit, then they might actually run them with like a sensory lens. So actually, you know, make stress balls, or make you know, lavender sachets, or make you know, make sensory kits, and so then a person, while they're on the inpatient unit, can sort of make the items for themselves and then keep them for themselves. So that's a way, I think, of being able to manage issues with hygiene. And yeah,
I think also it's you know, the environment's so important on the inpatient unit. They've done studies that have shown that just dimming the lights over a period of time has actually reduced incidents on a ward. You know, just more in the evening, you know, not just going from like full hospital lighting to lights out. Yeah. It's like, good luck sleeping with that.
Yeah. Plays havoc with your reticular activating system and makes it hard to, you know, get those sleep-wake cycles. But too, some inpatient units are heeding what Carolyn and I talk about in relation to sensory spaces. So trying to create zones or spaces in the units that people can sort of gravitate or, you know, walk in and out of, that have sort of sensory inputs. So there might be sort of a nature space, you know, that has like a garden and you know, fake grass and you know, plants and things like that. And then there might be a zone that's got you know, exercise equipment, or there might be a quiet zone, and so people can then, you know, that those environmental spaces are sort of tweaked and you know, with a sort of a sensory lens, and then people can sort of move in and out of those areas when they feel that they want to. So that's very person-centered, and the person having control over you know, exposure to that sensory input.
And that can sometimes work more than a sensory room, where some of them are locked, and then you're getting upset, but you've got to ask the nurses to unlock it for you. And then, you know, they might be busy, and, you know, then the person's like not being helped. So, you know, very much we think sensory spaces are a good way to go if that's possible.
A couple of questions here about self-harm. It's often described as quite, you know, overwhelming, compelling. How effective is sensory modulation in competing with such powerful urges? And also another question about any particular strategies for youth who is feeling suicidal.
Yeah, so I'm just taking the self-harm ones first. I think we need to ask the person, like, what the self-harm is doing for them. You know, like, how is it working? Why are they doing it? What's that sensory experience like? Self-harm is actually a sensory experience as well. And some people it's a visual experience, some people it's a touch experience, some people it's a pain experience. And so, you know, really non-judgmentally asking the person about why they're doing it and what happens with that. And then to look at, okay, well, this sensory input is along those lines. So it's not going to feel the same as self-harm, because, you know, self-harm is often something that someone has done over a long period of time and developed a habit. And so something new isn't going to feel the same. But we've had people, you know, have a lot of success with using alternative sensory input instead. So people who it's visual might like sort of, you know, using henna on their hands, or kind of like seeing the henna running down into the bath. I hope this isn't too triggering actually, but or you know, using an intense sensation. So you know, waxing the legs, or you know, mouthwash, or some of those other things that aren't going to be doing damage, but still a very, you know, very intense sensation.
Very icy cold, you know, ice, clutching ice, putting the, you know, icy cold gel packs. So I had a lovely young lady that I worked with who found that was really useful for her, and also intense bursts of movement. So really brief, intense jumping up and down on the spot and doing, and you know, for some of my clients it's been using multiple different strategies, but picking the ones that work well for them. Yeah, so that's sort of some of the examples. that I've worked with.
Yeah, and I guess, you know, suicidality is sort of, you know, bigger than just sensory modulation, but I guess, you know, some of the sort of things that can be helpful is, you know, either connecting with someone who loves you or having reminders of being loved, like having like videos or photos or safe smells that, you know, someone else, you know, does love you, or a safe space. Also, you know, using cold water sometimes to stop crying, because crying can really get too much. You know, when you're sort of sobbing for a period of time, it does just feel like it's not going to end.
It's hard to stop.
Yeah, expressing sadness is important, but if the ball goes rolling for too long, it can feel too overwhelming. So sometimes doing something that's a bit more of an intense sensation can shift that as well. Yeah. And
sorry, I was just going to, thought I would mention in relation to the alternative to self-harm, that when in our presentation, when we talked about forming new habits, so often it's really important for the person to work on practicing these new skills and using sensory input as an alternative to self-harm. And Carolyn and I talk a lot about mental rehearsal, but also sort of dress rehearsal, you know, physical rehearsal. And that's really, those two components are really important. So thinking through, okay, how, when I have these urges or these intense feelings and I get you know, that urge to self-harm, what am I going to do? I'm going to walk to the fridge, or I'm going to do, you know, go to my sensory kit and I'm going to collect this and I'm going to do that. And sort of, you know, making that mental plan and that process and creating that neural pathway, but also actually walking through it as well. So, you know, that practice, having those practice runs, and the more we can do that, the more we're sort of laying down or strengthening those alternate neurological pathways.
Great. Look, I just think I'm aware of the time. Are you okay with just one more question? And then I think we'll wrap it up. There's heaps of questions there, and I'm sorry to everyone that we didn't have a chance to answer. But I'll just send an email to Carolyn and Julie, and they might be able to answer some of them quickly in the email, and then I'll send it out to everyone. There's a number of people that have liked the question. I've seen people use a preferred scent to mask a trigger scent, i.e. carrying fabric with a preferred scent. So do you have any thoughts on this?
Love it.
Yes. Yeah. It's like that competing input. So Carolyn and I talk a lot about, you know, using sensory input to compete, you know, with messages or with other sensory input. And so, you know, for example, from a pain perspective, you know, that's where sensory modulation can have a role there as well. But absolutely, if there's a more intense or a more a powerful sensory input that you can actually use to compete with the other, that's great. And, you know, again, as we said before, sometimes it's about turning scent down. So, you know, using something like a nil odor, or trying to, if you can, it's always hard with scent, but if you can try and reduce scent, that's for people who are quite sensitive, that can be more helpful. But for others, using a competing scent or a competing sensory input can be very effective as well. So that's a great idea. Well done.
Great. Okay, well, I'd like everyone to thank Carolyn and Julie for the presentation. It's been really informative, really fantastic. So thanks very much. And I encourage everyone to go to bpdawarenessweek.com.au. There's a wide range of resources on the site that you can print off and use in your own practice wherever. So thanks very much for attending, and enjoy the rest of the week.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.